It's always fun to ride the nostalgia train every now and sometimes it's fun to not only ride that nice ride of nostalgia, but to actually analyze it. Why do we feel the nostalgia we feel? Why do we still feel drawn to the things that we feel nostalgia for? Why do we feel the need to believe those nostalgic things are somehow superior to the things we now consume? Nostalgia is a funny thing, a very funny thing. It blinds us to the way things are in reality. It gives us rose-tinted glasses, even when we go back and consume those things we once loved so much. But if we allow ourselves a critical eye, well then, we might actually be able to uncover the reality of the situation. Were things really better in the past? Were the movies and books and games of our youth really better than what is coming out now? So that is why we're going to be doing a deep dive into my favorite game. Why my favorite? Well, because nostalgia is inherently personal. And so we can't exactly detach it as an abstract and really do the topic justice. But I hope that me doing some interrogation into my own nostalgia will help others to interrogate their own. Because it's worth questioning why you feel the way you do about the things you believe you love rather than living your life uncritically. Question your own taste in the arts, just like you should question your own beliefs and wants. Question everything. But before we get all big-headed and ask questions of actual importance, like why we have the beliefs we have, let's start with just a game. Let's start with Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, because that's the game I've always considered to be my all-time favorite. San Andreas has been my favorite game for as long as I can remember, and I played it way too much when I was younger, and even when I replayed it as an adult, I still loved it, but my feelings have certainly changed. But before we get into any changes in my beliefs, let's look at San Andreas the way I used to see it. Part 1. The old me. The best way to look at any piece of media is to break it up into its composite parts and understand how they contribute to the whole. So, let's break it up into the game's world, the visuals, the on-foot gameplay, the vehicle gameplay, the overall narrative, the cast of characters, and the in-game radio. How did I see each of these things back in the day? How did I remember them? So, let's get started. The game's world. Wow. When I first got my hands on GTA San Andreas, I saw this massive world and I was amazed. I saw how huge it was, and it just left me excited to explore every nook and cranny of it. I found myself chilling around Grove Street, the protagonist's home, and seeing all I could see, exploring it on foot, checking out the various houses, and learning where many of the main characters lived. I even learned the names of Grove Street members who had died before the game's narrative started, and I imagined which houses they lived in. I wanted to soak it all in. But Grove Street was just the beginning. The game starts you off in Los Santos, a recreation of Los Angeles, and it has 3 major gangs that spawn in certain areas. You have Grove Street, the Ballers, and the Vagos, and then there is also the Aztecas, but they aren't one of the enemy gangs, so I mostly ignored them. I ended up learning which areas in the city were the territory of which gang, and I just knew it by heart. I pretty much knew that once you passed a certain street, you were entering into Baller's turf, and you'd better watch out. I was young when I played it, and so back then I didn't know that these gangs were based on things like the Crips and Bloods. I didn't know that. And I also didn't know that San Andreas took major inspiration from films like Boys in the Hood. So I thought it was such a unique world that was so different to my own. But things just got better as I explored a massive countryside with small towns dotted around, and I explored every town, and at one point I could have named every town by heart, but that time has since passed. But back then, I knew them all, and I knew which towns had which secrets in them. I knew that this town had these kinds of stores and this property to buy and blah blah blah. I even made up my own stories in this world. Hell, I once decided to take a holiday by putting some holiday clothes on my character, getting a camper, and going on a trip around the whole world. I stopped at places like a tourist and actually took pictures of it all. I even became embroiled in the conspiracy theory stuff around San Andreas. There's a debunked theory that Bigfoot can be found in the woods, and I probably spent more time looking for Bigfoot than I spent in most games. I did it all. And after leaving Los Santos in the game, you find yourself in San Fierro, a recreation of San Francisco, and my favorite city in the game. I spent countless hours exploring every alley, checking out the nearby gym and learning some new moves because that's something else you could do, and of course my favorite thing, getting your own chop shop and building it up. And then even getting a car showroom which spawns some nice cars, and even buying up a small RC business nearby. Hell, it was like building up your own empire. It was awesome. Not to mention the sights around San Fierro. I just love driving around, and of course I learned where some secrets could be found, because you need to know where all the secrets are, and I especially knew where to find body armor in every single city, because that's just something you need to have, isn't it? I even went around to tourist spots that hold nothing that's part of the game, but I just wanted to know everything I could about this world. I was fascinated. And then of course you make your way to Las Venturas, a recreation of Las Vegas, and you enter the casino business. I never much played the casino games myself because I struggled to understand things like roulette, but I did sometimes play blackjack. Well, I played blackjack when I got to be a bit older, and so learned some of that stuff. I mean, I first played it in 2005, and back then I was a measly little 11-year-old snot. I eventually got the game for myself, because I originally played it on someone else's PS2, by the time I was maybe 13 or so. And that's when I really fell into it. That's when I started playing it properly. And I played it through multiple times between the ages of 13 and about 17. Then I got a PS3 and moved on until I got it on Steam. And now I'm playing it for the second time since I got it on Steam. I'm 26 and yet I remember this damn world so much. But let's not think about current me yet. Let's instead continue on with how young me saw this game. The visuals. And when young me saw the visuals for the first time, he was rather shocked. Hell, when I got to be about 18 and game visuals had improved immeasurably, I still looked at San Andreas and thought that the game looked alright. The game's character models aged the fastest, but the world remained more detailed than most for quite some time. However, the facial animation was always bad to me. I always thought it looked rather terrible, but hey, who cares about visuals? They worked, and that was all that mattered to me. The on-foot gameplay. There had been games before that allowed you to run around shooting people. There had been games that allowed more advanced climbing, such as every platformer out there, and there had been games that allowed you to swim. But GTA San Andreas was the first to combine them all. For me at least. It had this massive world that could be explored on foot or in vehicles, and the on-foot exploration would really give you a chance to see it all more closely and to experience the sheer scale of things. You see, you don't much notice just how big a world is when you're speeding through it in a vehicle. But when you're running through it, oh, you see everything. But the running around is only part of the gameplay, and despite the expanded movement features like more climbing and swimming, there was also the combat gameplay. When I played it, back on the PS2, the first many times I played it through, I always loved the combat system. It had auto-aim that told you how much health your enemy had left, and you could cycle through enemies. It also had free aim, if that was what you wanted, and was perfect for pulling off some headshots. And that variety in combat was great back then. You could organically duck behind cover, and this was before the advent of cover mechanics. This was just you using a wall or car as a piece of cover, and then taking pot shots over and around it. And I was still replaying this game despite built-in cover mechanics becoming a bigger thing in other games. And I was never particularly taken in by them, because they took away much of the challenge of finding your own cover or taking out enemies before they got too close. Not to mention the fact that there was just such a variety of weapons to choose from in San Andreas, and as you use them, your stats with them would improve, and this would lead you to acquiring abilities like dual wielding and reduced recoil. You didn't arbitrarily choose upgrades from an RPG upgrade tree, you improved them by using them. This was a revolution to me. It was so much different to pretty much everything else out there. Variety, lots and lots of choices, so much to try out and experiment with. This was San Andreas, and I was loving every moment of it. The vehicle gameplay. Vehicles, oh vehicles, there are just so many to choose from. It's that whole variety thing all over again. You get to use so many vehicles in this game. The game's very first one is a bicycle, and it plonks you down and has you ride home. But the bicycle isn't all there is, because of course there's cars and motorbikes and boats, just like pretty much every other GTA game. But here's where it really stood out. It had all sorts of other things in it. You could ride helicopters and planes and jets and trains and hover cars and jetpacks, all the things. This was how I saw it. I just saw it as intense, endless variety, just like when you're on foot, but better. And of course, the variety of cars was great too. There weren't that many bikes or boats or planes, but the cars, so many. And I even remember becoming obsessed with collecting the rarest cars and stashing them in my garages around the city. I even managed to get my hands on a car called a Phoenix. And this car is so rare that there are very few ways to acquire it without cheating, but I did it. I managed to take it from Big Papa. But anyway, other than fueling that obsession in me, the cars in the game just handle nicely. Now, I was never that fond of many of the other vehicles handling, but I got used to it. I eventually became an expert with the in-game fighter jet, but that was in the old PS2 games. I was pretty good back then, but the handling was always something you had to get used to, and it was always rather frustrating to learn, especially learning to fly the fighter jet, but I got used to it and all was good. Cars are pick up and play though. I could go away from San Andreas for years and I'd still be able to come back and drive like ever before. Don't know if I can say the same about the rest of the game though, which generally took a bit to get used to most of the time. But one thing that I would always remember, something that would always be ingrained into my brain was, this game has a jetpack. No other GTA has ever accomplished that. The overall narrative. Okay, so to my young, underdeveloped brain, the narrative in San Andreas was just about the best thing that had ever been created in a video game. I cannot remember if I thought San Andreas had the best story of all time, seeing as I was still incredibly infatuated with the Lord of the Rings at the time, but in terms of video game narratives, I don't think I saw anything comparable for a very long time. The other GTA games which San Andreas inspired me to get my hands on never succeeded in being anywhere near as great as San Andreas. Never. I enjoyed all the other ones, but whenever it came to this one game, I would always defend it. And here's probably why. It's incredibly expansive. While something like GTA 3 amounts to rising through the ranks and getting revenge, and Vice City being the same, San Andreas had a narrative that just kept going. It wasn't about the rise of someone, but rather about the rise and fall and then the glorious meteoric rise of Carl Johnson, aka CJ. Now, I am going to be spoiling the overall narrative of this game, and if you don't want to get spoiled, then just skip ahead to the next section. You are Carl Johnson, and you are a high-ranking member of the Grove Street families, which is essentially based on the Bloods and the Crips, as I mentioned earlier. Your gang is in a turf war with a rival African-American gang called the Ballers, also based on the Bloods and Crips. And you're also going up against a Latino gang called the Vagos. You do a bunch of missions in Los Santos and slowly rebuild the gang until you're strong enough to take on the other gangs. Now, this alone was enough for me. You're building up this gang, and you can do things like take over turf and recruit fellow gangsters to join you on your rampages. It was awesome. Also, if you went and found some of the game's collectibles, you could upgrade your gang's overall equipment. So, yes please. Now, that was the rise of Carl Johnson. Then you get screwed over by some corrupt cops and must flee the city with your sister and her boyfriend. Los Santos has been taken over by your rival gangs and your brother's in prison. Everything sucks, but you manage to make some cash with the help of an unhinged woman who's actually the antagonist of GTA 3, because these games like to do callbacks. You make acquaintance with a triad leader and you get your hands on the deed to a car workshop in San Fierro. With this, you go to San Fierro and start life anew. You start building up your workshop, which becomes a chop shop, and you get optional missions to turn into a proper business, which only adds to that feeling of becoming a big shot, and then you start dealing with a gang in the city that helped your rival gangs back in Los Santos. You eventually manage to kill all of them and also take down one of the old Grove Street gang leaders, one of the big two who betrayed your gang back in Los Santos. Cool, so now you're starting to rise again, you're building a business and you're becoming friendly with a local triad. Eventually you get a call from the leader of that San Fierro gang you killed, and he's alive. He's also a government agent, and he makes loads of cryptic remarks about the role of the government in the United States, and to young me, this was simply awesome. He ends up enlisting you into a bunch of secret agent-like missions that range from awesome to immensely aggravating, and in the process you buy a small abandoned aircraft in the desert and learn to fly. Carl Johnson is an ex-gang leader, a business owner, a triad affiliate, and a pilot. He is straight up the most accomplished person I'd ever seen in a game, and that was way too cool for me, but it didn't end there. You get called to Las Venturas, and your triad buddy offers you a stake in a casino. You're now a casino boss too. But you only get this if you help them set up things and deal with the mafia in the area. And so you do that. You screw over the mob, not to mention the fact that one of the side missions involves planning a casino heist on one of those mob-run casinos, and that makes you a high-level thief too. You then end up saving a rapper's life and becoming his manager, helping him retake his mansion from the drug lord he sold it to, and that is when you return to Los Santos. You are now the manager of a rapper too. You are even more accomplished than before, but it doesn't end there. You get sent on one last secret agent mission, and it involves stealing a Harrier jet from a military vessel. You can fly fighter jets in this game. After that, the guy you did the secret missions for pulls some strings and gets your brother out of prison, and with him back, you retake territory in Los Santos until you finally catch the main traitor behind the whole thing and kill him. Then you kill the corrupt cop that was often behind him. You have successfully become the dominant gang leader in Los Santos. You own a business, you're a part owner of a casino, you manage a rapper, and, provided you decide to buy properties around the 3 cities, you're basically a ridiculous property magnate. I love this so damn much that I wrote all of this, everything about the narrative, without once looking anything up. I could go into more detail, but then we'd be here forever. So, just take my word that I was incredibly invested in the story of Carl Johnson and his glorious rise to the top. He was just incredibly awesome, and his story was awesome, but I've really only spoken about the story itself and not about something else that made the narrative in San Andreas such a blast. The cast of characters. Once again, the section has spoilers. You can't have characters without a narrative in which to contextualize them, but let's try to look at some of the characters in this game more in isolation. And I will probably list off every major character without looking them up, because I still know this game far too well. So, we already know a bit about Carl Johnson, aka CJ, because it's his story, and he's a great character overall because of his perseverance and drive to succeed. He's kind of a role model type. He came from very humble beginnings and became something big. He killed a lot of people, but he essentially got to the top through his own actions. However, CJ wouldn't have gotten to where he got without some of the people in his family. There's Sweet, his brother, and the overall leader of Grove Street Families. And there's Kendall, his sister, and her boyfriend Caesar basically becomes a member of the family as the narrative goes on too. And even though there is a huge cast of characters, the emphasis on the small gangbanging family was quite great to young me. CJ, unlike many characters in other games, is a family man. He doesn't just fight for friends and allies like many other gaming protagonists, but rather for something familial, which is certainly something you can argue against, but it certainly does give the game a more unique flair in that department. And when it comes to his family, Sweet is mostly stubborn and difficult to please. He isn't a character that endears himself to all that much, but he is a character you can respect. He has his convictions, and he isn't willing to change them for anyone. For instance, near the end of the game, when CJ manages to get him out of prison, Sweet just wants to go back to his gang, to his home. But CJ wants to move on, and this is what leads to CJ going back at all. He isn't the greatest character of all time, but he has strength and stubbornness, and that can be admirable. Then there's his sister Kendall, and she's actually a great character. Many female characters in games are there to be rescued or something similar, but this isn't the case with Kendall. She does have to flee with her boyfriend after the family gets run out of Los Santos, but so does her boyfriend and CJ. And when these guys start off in business, it's stated that they are useless in matters of business, and she becomes the head of their business ventures. It's heavily implied that she runs all of CJ's businesses and his properties, and so while this does still tie her directly to a man, it does make her a more autonomous character than many female characters in games, especially at the time, and especially to young me. Kendall's boyfriend, Caesar, also showed how, even though he's from a different gang, there can be unity between gangs through, essentially, romance. It's a Romeo and Juliet thing. Kendall's from one gang and Caesar's from another. If they fall in love, Caesar's also just shown as someone dependable, who can handle himself well. And that's CJ's family. But there's a lot more than just his family, and I love them all. The Grove Street Families has a few other people in it, namely Big Smoke and Ryder. Both of these characters are crafted rather well, or so I believed at the time, and their setup as traitors is well projected. Ryder is a drugged up gangster who isn't interested in loyalty, and Big Smoke is clearly ambitious and gunning for higher things. I never much liked Ryder, and so I didn't care when I killed him in game, but he is always portrayed as somewhat hate-worthy, whereas Big Smoke is a character who appears to care about you and wants to help you. And so when he ends up betraying you, it was horrible for young me. I was sad when I had to go after him by the end of the game. He was a character who seemed good but was always a bit off. I loved him. Oh, and there's also OG Loke, who's just this wannabe gangster rapper, and he was hilarious to watch. Now, before we leave the cast of Los Santos, and yes, there are still 2 more cities worth of people, we have to mention Crash. This is a group of corrupt cops that bother you from the very first cutscene in the game. The head of this group is Tenpenny, and his cronies are less important, and essentially just act as his little entourage. Tenpenny has his fingers around the gang's throats, and he's trying to make a profit all the while. He was one of the best, most hateful villains I'd ever come across in gaming at the time, and yet he never comes across as a cool guy, like many villains are, and is instead just someone you can hate. He's trying to screw everyone over and make as much money as he can. He has no loyalty and doesn't care about anyone but himself. Plus, he was voiced by Samuel L. Jackson, and so he was perfect. So now we can switch over to the interim character of Catalina, a psychopathic, murderous robber who helps you after you flee Los Santos. I both loved and hated her when I played this game back in the day. She's entertaining to watch, and everything she says is laced with hostility and aggression. I found her hilarious back in the day, plus her missions all involve robbing people, and they're often fun to play through. And in the interim, you also meet my old favourite, The Truth, a drugged up hippie who believes in all sorts of government conspiracy stuff. He was always just a delight to watch on screen, because he's so unlike everything else and he's just funny. Plus, his missions would involve things like going to specific locations to watch some suspicious vans, stealing a combine harvester from some cultish group, and burning down a weed farm while the camera sways as you get high from the fumes. And in many ways, that particular mission felt like a precursor to the weed field burning mission in Far Cry 3 that was such a blast. And in the end, you wind up driving him to San Fierro in his hippie camper while he talks about government conspiracies. He's delightful. So, let's move on to San Fierro then. Here, there aren't that many characters in this area of note, and it really is just 2 groups, the San Fierro Reefer / Loco Crime Syndicate, and the Triad. So let's first start off with the Reefer / Loco Crime Syndicate. This is the gang that worked with Big Smoke and had a hand in betraying you, and their purpose is mostly to be introduced and soon thereafter killed. The Connections guy is an irritating pimp named Jizzy B, and you kill him. And then there's T-Bone Mendez, the muscle, and you kill him too. They were never much to talk about back in the day. However, there is also Mike Torino. He's the leader of this group, and you end up killing him in a helicopter you shoot down, but then it appears that he survives and is a secret agent of sorts. He's the guy who ends up getting sweet out of prison after you help him a bunch. And he is a ton of fun too. Every bit of dialogue after you try to kill him is about what the government is really up to, and it's all extremely cryptic, but just so entertaining. He's like the evil government counterpart to the Truth, so he was just a fun boy to me. Then there's the Triad and its leader Woozy Moo, aka Woozy, and he's a blind gang leader who becomes your friend and later business associate when he opens the casino with you as a partner. He and the Truth always vied for classification as my favourite character back in the day. He's a good guy. He's just cool, and yes, I found the blind jokes to be funny back then, and the blindness was probably a big reason for liking him so much. He was blind, but he didn't let that stop him from leading a gang or from taking an active role in criminal activities. A great character. And at last, we find ourselves in the last section of the game, Las Venturas. CJ has now taken partial ownership of the casino, and you need to deal with a rival mafia in the area. And so you go undercover to take them down from the inside. This leads you to 2 major characters, the jumpy lawyer, Ken Rosenberg, from Vice City, and Salvatore Leone from GTA 3. And they are both just holdovers from those games, and they do their jobs. Leone is just a parody of mob bosses in general, and Ken is a freaked out lawyer who's afraid he's going to die at any moment because he's involved in the mob. By this point in the narrative, the new introductions of characters results in a few minor ones here and there, and the major characters, the new ones, were never as interesting as earlier ones. There are a few of these small characters like Mad Dog, but they really weren't that big as characters. And so, those are the characters of San Andreas, and I adored them, for the most part. A large cast of characters was, at the time, my sign of a good narrative. I was maybe a quantity over quality boy for a good while, but let's save that for later in the video. The in-game radio. Alright, so now that we've gone through the actual important stuff, we can talk about the fun old thing that is the music in this game. And the devs chose some great stuff. They are radio stations for various tastes, and seeing as I played this game over so many times, I would eventually get bored of one station and move on to the next. You see, the number of songs on each station does eventually start to loop, and it can be aggravating to listen to the same playlist over and over again. So, I started off listening to the classic hip-hop station, Playback FM, and I really couldn't tell you why I happened to start there. Then, as I got more into my teens, I got really into metal and hard rock in general, and so the alternative / grunge station, Radio X, and the classic rock station, K-Dust, became my go-to things. Then I ended up listening to all the talk radio stations, and then I got into the country music station, K-Rose. And I've never much liked country, but I was super into those songs, and some of them are just straight up classics. Now, of course, this video is on YouTube, and so I can't play any of that music, but you will find playlists online if you want to find them. Plus, the radio banter and adverts always made me laugh, except on K-Rose. Hillbilly humor never much did it for me. Much of the humor is either over the top or juvenile, but I was young, and young people get to like, stupid things. Some of the stations were never for me, never been into most rap or the poppy stuff, but you can't fault the devs there. I thought that then, and I think it now. They chose some good music for this game, and the early 90s had some great stuff to listen to. So, that's really all there is to say on that. And so that's the game. I guess we should move on. Part 2. A Tale of Nostalgia. Oh, I always looked back at San Andreas as this perfect thing. After I played San Andreas, I ended up going after every other Grand Theft Auto I could. I played through GTA 3, Vice City, Liberty City Stories, Vice City Stories, GTA 4, Lost and Damned, and The Ballad of Gay Tony. I never managed to get my hands on Chinatown Wars, because I didn't have a PSP, and I tried and failed to get into GTA 2. But the first two games were a lot different and just not what I was looking for. Now, none of these games ever managed to match up to San Andreas for me. That game was the quintessential Grand Theft Auto game. It was wonderful. And then when Rockstar announced that GTA 5 would be set in Los Santos, well, I maybe fanboyed out a little too hard. I pre-ordered the game, and it was the first time I'd ever done that, and I got a special poster with it that I still have, and when the time came for the game to come out, I took a week off work. It also happened to be my birthday, okay? So I had a better excuse than me want to play a video game. But it was the real reason. I spent the better part of 3 days going through that game and finishing it, and I loved it. I really did, but it took me a long time to accept that it also disappointed me. It was my great hype story. A game that had not lived up to what I was expecting. I wanted a spiritual successor of sorts to San Andreas. I wanted a follow-up to the game that had never been beaten. I didn't get to have that. A few years later, I got GTA San Andreas on Steam and I replayed it. I enjoyed it, but the memory strangely faded. But I kept thinking about how GTA 5 had not been able to live up to what I wanted. And eventually, as I became more self-reflective, I started to wonder whether or not San Andreas really was all I'd made it seem in my head. So I wanted to replay it and properly analyze it this time. I wanted to know whether or not it was what I'd remembered. Was it really the best game ever made? Was it my personal favorite of all time? Part 3. What changed? I grew up a lot between 2012 and 2020. I last played San Andreas before my PS2 went the way of the dodo, and that was in early 2012. I would have been 17. My critical thinking skills were not particularly advanced by then. And I replayed San Andreas, for the purpose of this video, in late 2020. A lot changed. My perception of things changed more than I realized. And so we've already looked at what I thought of the game back in the day, so let's look at how I see it now. 8 years on, I had a whole lot more analytical experience, gaming knowledge, and overall pessimism. So let's see how things changed when I went back to the game all those years later. The game's world revisited. So, the world! This wonderful world that I adored so much, has it withstood the test of time? Well, for the most part, I would say that the world is one of the most enduring things about San Andreas. It's large and varied. It has 3 distinct cities with 3 distinct countryside locales, and they all feel quite different to each other. There are the rockier areas around Los Santos, the larger plains and forested areas around San Fierro, and the desert regions around Las Venturas. It feels like multiple biomes contained within a single game, and I still see it as one of the more impressive game worlds out there. Sure, some worlds are a lot more detailed, but this thing is from 2004, so you do need to temper your expectations a bit. However, now that I'm a bit more grown up and all, I don't much care for just how many collectibles there are to find. I mean, you need to find 50 tags to spray paint over in Los Santos, 50 special photos to take in San Fierro, 50 horseshoe collectibles in Las Venturas, and 100 oysters to find in the water around the entire world's map. When I was younger, I went and downloaded those maps so I could find all of the collectibles. Now, I just find it irritating. Now, much of that has to do with the fact that I am now an old man who doesn't have time for nonsense like that. I don't care to drive all over a map and find all the little things, exploring all the Easter eggs I can find, and discovering hidden trivia. All that was for a younger person, a person who didn't have access to any disposable income whatsoever, and who didn't have access to Steam sales. That's a person who had the time to focus on one game, someone who spent 117 hours on one playthrough of San Andreas where he attained a 100% completion of the game. I went full completionist. I would never do that again. But back then, a game like this was perfect. It was huge and had so much room and stuff to do. When you have a budget and can only get a game every now and then, well, that's when a game like this is sheer perfection. There's a lot to do and lots of time to do it. But now? Well, now I just view things a bit more harshly. I used to think it was cool that there were so many mini games. Now I see it as padding, and also occasionally forcing you into mini games is irritating. Being able to buy a property was once an awesome thing for me, but now I see it as a way to increase the number of save locations in-game. Because this is before the days of auto-saving in GTA games. This is back when you had to save at a safe house and nowhere else. And so buying a property allows you to save in more areas, and so it saves you on the time needed to drive all over the place. But other than that, the property purchasing doesn't have much value in it. And so that's how I now see the world. It's padded with a lot of unnecessary stuff, relatively empty in terms of size versus meaningful content, and a lot of the stuff you can do is just a bit boring. I see it differently now, but I still remember the wonder I felt back then. Having such a huge world to explore was wonderful, and while I don't feel the need to explore it anymore, I still remember many of the little shortcuts here and there. I know my way around the map, and I can even find secrets in-game without ever opening the map in the menu. I know this world better than any other world, and for that reason, it'll always have a place in my heart. But at least I now know how to criticize the things I once loved uncritically. So, what else can I criticize? The visuals revisited. Okay, this is the easiest one. The game, by today's standards, does look pretty ugly. All the characters still have that polygon ugliness that many of us remember from the PS1 and early PS2 days. There are no smooth shapes, just these harsh, jutted lines. And of course, the thing that always ages first, the facial animations. They are truly hideous. But if there's one thing that doesn't matter in a game, in my opinion, it's the visuals. Sure, when a game is pretty, you can gawk at it for a good long while, but graphics need to be functional. And they are still functional in San Andreas. I know what's happening on screen, and so I don't have any real criticism for it. Scenes and rooms may look very minimalist, but what do you expect from something rather old? It's fine. There's nothing wrong with the graphics. They were good for their time and they're adequate now. The on-foot gameplay revisited. Okay, but the on-foot gameplay has aged a bit more than the visuals. So all that lovely variety I was talking about before, yeah, that is really more of a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none kind of thing. And this does also apply to the next section, but let's first talk about what it's like on foot, why don't we? So, it never feels particularly smooth when running around. The platforming stuff is very contextual and only comes up on particular missions, the shooting is stunted, and of course, there's the absolute fear that comes with playing this game for prolonged periods of time. This particular issue doesn't slot nicely into any of these neat little categories, but it's most likely that you'll die when on foot, so let's call death an on-foot thing. When you die or get busted by the cops in San Andreas, you get sent to a hospital or police station with some cash gone. That's fine, isn't it? It's just money, nothing else. It isn't like they take all your weapons away or anything. Weapons that often took a long time to get your hands on and that are integral to you getting through the longer missions in the game. It isn't like there's absolutely no quick or auto-saving function in the damn game. It isn't like you could lose lots of progress through an accidental slowing down of your car and then a cop arrests you. It isn't like your progress can be pushed back just far out of nowhere. Okay. So, yeah. That's a bit frustrating. And seeing as the PS2 games are now gone, you'll likely play this on PC. And the PC version makes save scumming irritating. You see, there is no way to access the load menu from the in-game menu. So, if you die and you don't want to lose everything, you have to quit out of the game and reload from that menu. There's a dedicated button on the menu to start the game over, but no button for loading up a save. Well done. Okay. But that's getting away from the actual on-foot stuff. The game, when on foot, is just kind of janky. Like all Rockstar games, this is still an issue. GTA 5 and Red Dead Redemption are also clunky to play. The game tries to be everything, and that's where it really feels weak. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the next section. The vehicle gameplay revisited. Ooh, I grew up a lot since playing San Andreas back in the day. I used to think that the vehicle handling in this game was the best vehicle handling outside dedicated driving games. You know, like a Need for Speed or Burnout obviously has better driving, but for a game that wasn't all driving, I thought San Andreas was amazing. And oh, I disagree with my younger self quite substantially now. I still give the cars a pass. For the most part. The cars handle just fine, they're functional and they're diverse, I still like that. In one game you can drive a speedy supercar and immediately afterwards you can get into a big truck and cruise around and take wide turns. I still appreciate all that. But yeah, not so much when it comes to literally every other type of vehicle. You get thrown off bikes far too quickly. The trains are basically a pointless gimmick vehicle that's mostly useless to drive around in. And the boats are just meh. There's nothing special there. The bicycle can still be pretty alright if you can do some tricks. But playing it on PC, I could not for the life of me figure out how to do half the things I could do as a child. And all of this is nothing in comparison to the big bad guy in San Andreas vehicles, and that's aircraft. The game is not optimized for PC for proper controller configurations, and with a mouse and keyboard it's horrible to control. And you have to pass a special flying school to be allowed to continue with the main campaign, and many of those challenges are damn near impossible with a mouse and keyboard. So trying to play this damn thing now is just, well, you can only really describe it with a noise like this. Okay. The planes are fine, for the most part, but the helicopters and the fighter jet are horrid, and you can't escape this section without discussing a mission called Free Fall. In this mission from hell, you have to fly a small propeller plane behind a private jet, and here's the thing, jets are faster. So you have to do this whole screwing the system thing and fly high above the jet and then dive bomb it to gain the momentum you need. This mission nearly made me quit the damn game, and I never had trouble with it as a snot-nosed brat, but I was playing it on the PS2, and it seems to be a better version of the game. Which is great in this PS5 era we're in at time of writing. So yeah, the vehicles don't exactly hold up. Also, the jetpack is kind of just disappointing now. It's slow and there's no radio. Nostalgia gives you some wonderfully rose-tinted glasses, doesn't it? The overall narrative revisited. The story, has it changed for me? Well, I certainly did find games with better narratives in the interim. The first time I truly realized the narrative potential of games was after San Andreas had been a major replay of mine several times over. And I can actually remember what those games were. In 2012, when I was in my final year of high school, I got my hands on the PS2 version of the original Deus Ex and Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. I had decided to pick up Deus Ex because I used to read a local gaming magazine which I now actually occasionally contribute to. Check out the link down below. And it spoke with excitement about a new game called Deus Ex Human Revolution. I didn't own a PS3 at the time, but I was dutifully saving up for one. It's not as easy to play the latest games when mommy and daddy don't buy you one. So, for me, I decided to try out this Deus Ex thing and wow. Just wow, I was blown away. It had a narrative unlike anything I'd ever seen before, and it was glorious. So many options to choose from, so much to do. I played it peacefully, focused on dialogue, and tried not to kill anyone. And in my next playthrough, I murdered everyone. And then, well, I can't remember after that, but I know I played till the halfway point about 4 times. That game just kept giving me more. Then, of course, came my very next game, and it was Metal Gear Solid 2. And I was often confused, having only vaguely played the first one a few times, but it had some serious talks with you, and the whole ending just amazed me. These 2 games changed my perspective on what games could do. And then I got a PS3, and I was able to play all sorts of narrative-focused games that completely bashed San Andreas out the water. And so now I look at San Andreas, having replayed it in preparation for this video, and, well, it certainly is a fun experience. But things just kind of happen in it. Many of the missions seem to arrive out of nowhere with no narrative justification for why they are happening. And certain narrative beats just become irritating contrivances for me. For instance, the whole part where you have to flee Los Santos. Cool narrative moment, sure, but the actual game itself then did the whole thing where you start in a new area with none of the weapons you've spent hours upon hours building up. So it irritates more than anything else. Plus, while it is entertaining to wind up doing those special agent missions and all that, it is rather silly. It was a complete tonal shift from taking down rival gangsters to stealing military hardware to sink surveillance ships. From rebuilding your life in a new city to getting handed a casino for doing a few odd jobs here and there. It's cool and fun and everything, but it's unlikely and a bit silly. You get taken out of it more than it brings you in. It just feels like they wanted to cram as many cool things in as possible, while failing to really make it feel like a cohesive whole. It's still silly fun, and that's just fine, but at least something like Vice City, which came out before San Andreas, was a bit more consistent in your overall goal. To become a powerful and later independent criminal force in the city. But I do still appreciate that the GTA character who is by far the most successful, more than every other protagonist, is a black character who came from a poor, gang-riddled area. Tommy Vercetti from Vice City became like Scarface, but he never owned a casino. Sure, Nico Bellic from GTA 4 became a wealthy, random guy, but he never owned properties across 3 cities. Sure, Michael and Trevor and Franklin from GTA 5 made some money through heists, but that mostly amounted to getting some nice homes and not much else. Carl Johnson is the most successful character in a Grand Theft Auto game, and I still love him as a character. I adore him, his attitude and his drive. And so what about the other characters in this game? Do I still love them? The cast of characters revisited. Okay, so first things first, I still love the Truth. He is perfect just the way he is, and I'll have nothing said against him. So, now that we've sorted that out, let's move on to some of the other characters. I still like CJ, as I've just said. But Sweet and Ryder and Big Smoke, yeah, take them or leave them. They're purely functional to the narrative, and I don't feel like they stand out in any particular way. Kendall is great, and she's an earlier representation of a female character who can hold her own with the male characters. But her entire purpose is essentially tied in with CJ and Caesar. She operates their businesses, but she does so mostly behind the scenes and therefore gets comparatively little screen time. Her boyfriend gets far more screen time, and his function is pretty much to just help you with some of the things you need to do. And we're gonna jump a bit to Catalina because she is the only other female character in the game. She's portrayed as overly emotional and psychopathic. and does make her fun, but it also feels like an extremely exaggerated stereotype of an emotional, dangerous woman. She's still entertaining to watch, but in the same way that you might watch something from back in the day that has not aged well with what it thought to be funny. And you enjoy it, but with a constant caveat that something like it probably shouldn't be made again. So, now that we're done with the whole 2 female characters in this game, we can get back to the men. Tenpenny is still fun because he's just a horrible corrupt cop, and in the modern day that feels just more and more relevant, especially in the news you hear out of the United States. So, his little group of corrupt cops is pretty on point. Woozy is still a delight, but the depiction of his blindness is both progressive and problematic. Sure, he's still able to handle himself despite his blindness, and he's well respected. But on the other side of things, the game does make constant jokes about his blindness, and there is a part where he just straight up runs into a wall. So you have some progressive ideas in there about disabled people being just as capable, but he also has to be the butt of many jokes. So, yeah. Moving on, Mike Torino is still a blast. He's still a dodgy government type, and he's also very blunt about the way in which the United States government does things. He openly talks about backing coups in foreign countries and about bringing drugs into his own country. He's a great satirical character, and he's probably aged better than many of the other characters. Whereas Ken Rosenberg is just a scared lawyer and Salvatore Leone is just a mob boss parody. There's no real substance there, just here's the mob boss guy, and look, his name is the same as Corleone from the Godfather films. Look, we can do references, but hey, it was 2004, so give them a break. Let's move on. The in-game radio revisited. I gave a whole load of praise about the music in this game from when I was young, and you might expect me to rescind some of that like I have with all this other stuff, but nope, I still love this music. I will occasionally find the radio stations on YouTube and just listen. But much of this music has now become foundational to me. San Andreas is one of the things that cemented what kind of music I like. Well, San Andreas and Guitar Hero. They both have a lot to do with my musical tastes. And Vice City. But just the rock station. So yeah, San Andreas still has great music. However, you can criticize the radio station segments themselves, the parts where the DJ speaks. Sure, there aren't too many songs in each station, and so it can get tiring fast, but that would have been a space limitation thing, so you can't really criticize that. It would be unfair. But the adverts and segments with the DJs, that humor is often rather hit and miss. Especially now. But humor ages faster than everything else, so what was funny in 2004 is definitely not funny anymore. Times have changed, some of the ads are still great though, and make for fantastic satire. Practically every ammunition ad in the entire series is pure delight. Other ads swing and often miss, but hey, you can't expect it to stay funny forever. Also, I've put a link to a video that just has ammunition ads in it, and it's fun. PC technical difficulties. And now we find ourselves at a surprise category. Everything has built up to this one great final moment. You see, when I played this game over and over again back in the day, it was as a vehement PS2 boy. I adored it on that platform, but here's the thing. My PS2 is no longer around. Sadly, it died. Old age, an accumulation of dust, and, of course, the fact that my grandmother accidentally spilled an entire smoothie all over it led to its ultimate demise. But I later got the game on Steam and got to replay it for the first time in about 6 or so years, and that replay was 2 years before I replayed it for this video. And let me tell you, PC releases are not necessarily the best versions of a game. The PC release of the game has some of the worst remapping of controls I've ever seen. You see, some functions in the game are linked to other controls that you may not be able to find once you remap them. There's abysmal controller support, and things like piloting a plane or helicopter are horrible with a mouse and keyboard, and let's not even get into the problems with the hydraulics competition minigame. And this is all made worse by the fact that the game back on the PS2 was limited to 30 FPS, and that was retained for the PC release, because maybe some aspects of the game kind of break when you go higher. There is a way of unlimiting the frame rate, and that makes much of the game so much smoother to play, but for some reason you literally can't dive underwater when the frame limiter is off. So if you're not set to 30 FPS, your character can't dive, and diving is necessary for several missions. And when the frame limiter is off, and when the frame rate is shooting up into like 100 FPS, it looks smooth as hell, but you can't do certain things with cars or planes. It is one of the weirdest and most annoying things I've ever experienced. Then there's just the fact that the game isn't all that stable on PCs, and I experienced a number of crashes. And then there's the egregious fact that the devs never decided to add in an autosave or quick save function for the PC release, which shouldn't have been difficult on that system. And so let's just say that you do a few missions and play around a bit for an hour and the game crashes. Well, you just lost all that progress. It's just gone. It's infuriating. Now, I did my best to not allow these things to colour my experiences replaying the game. And most of what I spoke about before had nothing to do with the technical aspects of the game. But of course, you can never be entirely sure that something like technical difficulties won't change your opinions on something. So that is just something to keep in mind with regard to my experience with this game all these years later. It shouldn't make much of a difference to most of it though. It maybe just made some missions a bit more annoying. But that's enough of that. Let's move on. Part 4. Why do I still call San Andreas my favorite game? I became obsessed with the GTA franchise after San Andreas. It made me play all the other games, and it got me into crime movies and books. It made me appreciate world building in my own writing. I even wrote a crime novel because of the influence of GTA. And that novel even has the same plot as a GTA game. A criminal going from small time to big shot. This thing changed the entire trajectory of my life. I played it so much that I wanted to write a walkthrough for it, and I have never before or since contemplated writing a walkthrough for any game. I even wanted to learn how to do those ASCII drawings that they used to do in old walkthroughs. But if you're a bit younger, you probably won't even know about those. Now, after the first few hours of this most recent playthrough, I really started to enjoy it again. The beginning of many games is dull, and San Andreas is the same, but damn, I just loved it once it got going. The game is still able to be something that I really enjoy playing, aside from a few of the more annoying missions, and that was usually down to technical difficulties. But I've matured a lot since I first played this, and I played this thing religiously. But why do I still call this my favorite game of all time? To be honest, part of the reason is habit. It's been my answer to the question of what is your favorite game for so long. I mean, what am I supposed to say now? Am I supposed to come up with a new favorite? Now, when it comes to all other media, I've grown up a lot. I don't have a favorite book or song or band or movie. I have lists of what I consider to be the best, but I've long since stopped trying to make a personal top 10. I find it a mostly immature exercise now, trying to decide what your favorite is in a sea of fantastic stuff. But I think I still call it my favorite because of how influential it is. There are games I enjoy much more, and after replaying San Andreas this time, I have a feeling that I might never play it again. I tried to replay Vice City and GTA 3 a few years ago, and I realized how dated they were. GTA 4 still held up, but the others are sadly just too dated now, for me at least. I've gotten too used to modern conveniences, but I'll never forget how much this game shaped me for years and years. It's no longer my favorite, and I need to stop saying that it's my favorite. A favorite should be something that you can hold up every time you replay it. And if we go by games that I've replayed more than any other, then the PS2 exclusive Jak 3 is probably my favorite game. But I would never say that if you asked. I'd never call it my favorite game. When I replayed it on the PS3 HD collection, I still loved it. And it hasn't aged much, but I still wouldn't call it my favorite. I find it a strange thing to contemplate. Looking back at San Andreas, I see all the things that influenced me, and I'll always be immensely thankful to it for doing everything it did for me. But I think it's time for me to retire the game. I now fully realize all the places it's broken and weaker. I now see that it doesn't hold up like it once did. And I also know that the PC version of it isn't that great. I think it's time for me to be done with Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. You served well all these years and I'll always remember you, but I think that you should forever be considered one of my favorite games now. A favorite game with many caveats. But you were the last one. I decided quite a few years ago that I no longer have a favorite movie or song or band, and instead decided that I wouldn't rank them like that, but I still held on to you. And it's time for that to end. Goodbye, San Andreas. You were always my favorite, but I have other things to play. New experiences to experience. And at least I can step away from you without having rose-tinted glasses. I see you for all your faults, and I love you for having such an impact on me. But it's time to move on. It's time to stop focusing on the past, because it wasn't better. It was just different. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you liked it. So it was a more emotional one, in a sense, to write and to think about. But I think it's an important thing to do. But anyway, this is the end of the video, so this has been Lupus, and you can find my other videos on this channel. You can subscribe, like, comment, share, do all the things. It would be lovely. And also you can find me on like Twitter at LCLupus or LC_Lupus. And yeah, that's about it. I hope that you have a great day. Ta-ta.